So what I'm going to talk about today is a slice of my scholarship, but it's based on a principle that kind of informs my teaching as well. If you've ever seen me crossing the quad to class, you may notice that sometimes I have a lot of stuff. And that's because when I teach early literature, I like to bring in the material culture of the time. And that's why my office is filled with things like old coins and medical instruments and the ingredients for ink, and why I ask students to do needlepoint and learn about distillation and, God forbid, build a chariot. So, you know, in part these things are about motivation and engagement, which is important when you're dealing with early material, but I also believe, firmly believe, that they help people understand the literature and that they can lead to insights. So that principle is actually something I'm going to try to showcase in just a piece of a scholarship that I've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a literary problem, and then I'm going to talk about the source of an idea I had about solving that problem, and I'll kind of work through the steps that I took to get to the solution. And this is sort of part of a larger interest I've had in time and chance in Renaissance texts. Sometimes I'll say Renaissance, sometimes I'll say early modern. Early modern kind of goes from Middle Ages till around 1700. Renaissance is, you know, well, you all know the famous Renaissance. So I kind of sometimes use them interchangeably. Probably shouldn't do that, but you may catch me doing that today. So the problem is as follows. I teach Romeo and Juliet whenever I do Shakespeare, and whenever I teach Romeo and Juliet, I ask my students, you know, how many of you studied this play in high school? Which is a really silly question because they all raise their hands, right? So this play is like the most frequently done play in high school. You yourselves may have, you know, read it in high school, but then I ask, you know, how many of you read it in high school and loved it? And about half of them raised their hands. How many of you read it in high school and you hated the play? Well, the other half raises their hands. So I ask them. I always say, you know, what's the problem? Why do you not like Romeo and Juliet? And it always boils down to a very simple statement. Romeo and Juliet are idiots. They don't need to die, right? It all comes down to the fact that Romeo shows up 15 minutes, maybe less, too early, right? Now, if you hopefully you remember Romeo and Juliet. If not, it's these famous star-crossed lovers. Their families are at odds. Their mentor, Friar Lawrence, comes up with this complicated plan to get them together that involves Juliet drinking something that's going to make her look dead. Her family will bury her, and Romeo will show up at the tomb, and they'll live happily ever after. Well, of course, he shows up early, doesn't get the message. He thinks she's dead, kills himself. She wakes up, kills herself. Voila, tragedy, right? It does sound a little strange, right? But it turns out that the student's concern with this is also a lot of the critical concern about the play. That scholars have done a lot to sort of avoid talking about that issue. One recent scholar even said, look, if you focus too much on the mistiming at the end, you're being unsympathetic, right? Like you just gotta, like, you know, give the play a break. And he also said, well, because if you pay too much attention to that, well, you know, for us, like failures of timing are unfortunate. They're not really tragic, right? There's that sort of disjuncture there, and if it's not a tragedy, well, it's clearly not a comedy, so it's pretty much nothing, right? So some scholars have kind of responded to that by doing things like concentrate on the language. It's gorgeous language. It deserves every bit of attention you can give to it. Pay no attention to the ending. Other scholars have said, okay, you know, like it's a tragedy of character. You know, the Romeo and Juliet, what happens to them in the end, just makes so much sense in terms of their character. But that problem with the action hasn't really gone away. And so this is like potentially still, in some ways, a kind of an unsolved problem that scholars try to avoid sometimes try to deal with. And you know, it's like in the back of your mind, especially if you teach the play, it's like one of the things that you need to think about if you're going to try to make the play work for, say, students in a classroom. All right, so rewind a little bit. I was at in Chicago teaching at the Newberry Library program. This was a couple years ago, and so in Chicago for the fall semester, Marcy and I did this, and you know we were looking for things to do, and I was looking for some some exercise other than running in circles, which I do a lot. Marcy also runs. But I wanted something else, and I came across this group called the Historical European Martial Arts, which is like this worldwide group. They have a chapter in Chicago at a gym called Fortezza Fitness, and they offer these classes. So of course I saw this, and I thought, how cool is that? I'll get some exercise, maybe I'll learn something. So I signed up for the class, and I met these very odd people who do this work. They are actually scholarly in lots of ways. So what they do is they go and they take the early texts and they translate them, they come up with modern editions of them, and then they pore over them trying to reconstruct what was actually meant by this very dense and difficult prose that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when you read it, right? So they spend their time doing this, but they're scholars with like very narrow focus. When you take a class from them, it's like a cross between being in a lecture and being in a workout. Because every time you're doing something wrong, right, first they will go back and they will quote the text to you, sometimes in Italian, okay? So Renaissance swordsmanship, as I'll explain, all comes from Italy. And then they'll kind of translate it and explain what they have discovered over time about what that means and what it is you're doing wrong. So it's a very interesting group. And there comes a point when, I was messing up a lot, and one of the things that I apparently had a problem with was something called false time, okay? Which, so they're trying to explain what that is, and they explain the concept, the Italian concept of tempo in fencing. And my instructor, who was a little bit like Porthos in the Three Musketeers, right? I had another instructor who was like Cardinal Richelieu, who was like really scary. But what he said was, okay, so in the original text, tempo is either the pause between action or the action in between pauses. Okay? And I thought, all right, so that's really hard to figure out, and we had to talk a little bit more about that. But that also, my ears started to prick up there, because you do Renaissance swordsmanship, and if you're teaching Shakespeare, you know that Romeo and Juliet is a play where there is a lot of stage fighting, and it's also more than in any other play, and certainly it's a play where characters talk more about fencing than they do in any other play. And that itself is an area where I think criticism has been a little bit lax. There has been attention to it, but mostly what scholars have done is try to track down sources and what school's being referred to here. It hasn't, the work hasn't really gone to the high stakes. So why is this in this play about these lovers? What are the connections there? Not that hasn't been done. It hasn't been done as much. So my ears pricked up, and I thought, hey, what if tempo, fencing, tempo, timing, Romeo and Juliet? What if the timing, the problems of the tragedy, the timing in this play, what if that were, in some sense, the key to the tragedy? And what if there is some attitudes that we have changed or lost or differed from, right? So that in its original context, it would have been maybe more tragic than it is today, when half of my students are thinking it's just silly, right? Maybe there's something there. That was my moment of inspiration. That's my kind of the reenactment moment. I will get to show you a little bit about Renaissance swordsmanship a little bit later on. But if I wanted to try investigating this, which I eventually did, I had to sort of start from a variety of perspectives. So, for instance, I wanted to ask, to what extent does the early modern period is it really interested in tempo and these kind of ideas about timing, and what might that look? So, fortunately, I know from my other work, right, that this period, the early modern period, is in fact just generally obsessed with time itself. Right? It's a period where, among other things, clocks are seriously developed and expanded, including pocket watches. So here's an early pocket watch. Do you notice anything odd about this pocket watch? Yeah?
It only has one hand.
Only one hand, right? They're so inaccurate that, in fact, it doesn't really make much sense to be measuring the minutes, let alone the seconds. It wasn't until late in the 17th century that they added a minute hand to these pocket watches. And that tells us something, which is that tons of experiences are occurring below the threshold of their ability to measure them, yet they are very interested in measuring them. So they are, in some sense, their interests are being driven to below sort of the threshold of measurement. And pocket watches are the worst example. They did have more accurate means in other forms, but they were very interested, in particular, in the smallest moment of time, the instant of time, or as it's sometimes called, the instant of change. I'll use those two interchangeably, because if you're interested in the tiniest moment of time, you're usually interested in transitions from one state to another or from one place to another, right? Like how does that particular thing happen? And as it happens, several human experiences were thought to occur in an instant. Several important human experiences were thought to occur in an instant. So there was some interest driving this beyond the scientific. The most famous, of course, is death, right? Death occurs in an instant. These days we have brain death and body death, and maybe we're like stretching this out, but to this day, like people will write down time of death, and we think of people as either being alive or dead, not some like where in between that. So we still think of death in many ways as occurring in an instant, but they certainly did in the Renaissance. Here's John Donne, right? He loved talking about the instant of time and the instant of change. And here's from the Holy Sonnets. This is one here. He says, "This is my play's last scene. Here heavens appoint my pilgrimage's last mile, and my race, idly yet quickly run, hath this last pace. My span's last inch, my minute's latest point, and gluttonous death will instantly unjoin my body and my soul, and I shall sleep apace." So notice how he's like driving our attention towards that instant moment of death. The way he's doing it is particularly interesting. So what we get is a series of increasingly kind of like smaller increments as you get closer to death, right? Like last inch, last point. And you begin to wonder, he's also pointing our attention to a particular issue. If you can keep drawing smaller and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, like, when does it happen, right? And how do you even get there, right? Because the poem could go on, right? Just come up, you run out of words to talk about, the tininess of the instant that separates you from the thing that's going to happen. So he raises actually a philosophical problem, and I'll use the term philosophical in a broad sense, and the Renaissance includes science. So I'm just going to sort of paper it over with natural philosophy. So, like, what does this, where does this come from? Well, back in the classical era, this problem had been theorized by a guy named Zeno, who came up with these paradoxes, which are, they're famous to, these days you sort of have to introduce Zeno, and I will tell you a little bit about Zeno. But in the early modern period, Zeno was enough of a household name that you could simply refer to Zeno, be like, just as Zeno, denied motion, and we're like, oh yeah, right? Now we have to take a little time with it. So, what is Zeno? Here's Zeno's paradox. This is Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles is going to chase down the tortoise. Achilles is, of course, famously fast. He's also like really good at killing people and some other things, right? But he's, one of the things you get in the Iliad is like fleet-footed Achilles, right? So he's chasing down this tortoise, and the question is that Zeno asks is like, how's he going to catch the tortoise, right? Because he runs along, and at a certain point he reaches where the tortoise was. But by then the tortoise has moved on, maybe not a lot, right? It's the tortoise, but it's moved on. So then Achilles has to run to catch up to where the tortoise was, and by then the tortoise has moved on a little bit, and Zeno said, how can Achilles ever catch the tortoise? At every moment when he gets to a spot, the tortoise has gone further on. So solving Zeno's paradox, and it's been solved in lots, multiple ways, right, over time. And you even have modern examples of people talking about Zeno's paradox and what the solutions are. That solving this, or thinking even about this, requires really careful attention to time and motion. And we have today, in this room, if you're looking at this, the instant solution you would probably think about is you'd say, well, like the tortoise is moving ahead, but it's smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And this looks like an infinite series, which we know can have a finite limit, right? And we have the mathematics, right, to be able to do this, to solve it mathematically, to say, like, here's how it works, right? It's going to catch the tortoise. Here's when he'll catch the tortoise, right? That mathematics, by the way, is invented or discovered, depending on how you look at it, in the early modern period. And it involves limits. It's involved with the discovery of probably the most famous mathematical discovery, the one that most of my advisees lament, which is the discovery of calculus, right? Which was discovered in part to explain motion in the heavens, right? So it's it is all about motion in some ways. So you could draw a line from John Donne to the discovery of calculus, or even Romeo and Juliet to the discovery of calculus, but I'm not going to go there. Suffice it to say that, right, these are some of the philosophical ideas there that are raised by this question of time and motion. There is, besides death though, there's one other major experience that is also thought to occur in an instant. And if death, I'll give you a hint here, because I'm going to ask you, like, so death's important for Romeo and Juliet, right? What's the other thing that's important for Romeo and Juliet?
Sex.
Marriage.
Thank you. Yeah, sex doesn't occur in an instant. Maybe for you.
Watch it.
So there's this idea of instant change, that love happens instantaneously, and we still have this idea around that that when you fall in love, that there's like a moment when you are suddenly realize that you're in love. But certainly in this period, it was thought to occur instantaneously. Here's Jacques Ferrand, French thinker, who wrote a very famous book about treating love sickness. For him, it's a disease, right? He's a doctor, he's going to treat this. And love, he says, comes in through the eyes, right? Slips through the passageways, traveling imperceptibly by way of the veins to the liver, where she suddenly imprints an ardent desire for that object that is either truly lovable or appears so. Right? The key here, right, there are two words here. One is suddenly, right, like it's this instant moment. The other is imperceptibly, which for Ferrand doesn't really mean without symptoms. It means below the level, the threshold of perception itself, right? So you don't say, well, love's here now. No, it's here, right? Like in terms of the experience of the lover, right? It occurs all at once. This is the idea of love at first sight. We mock this idea. It was mocked, in the Renaissance as well. Shakespeare has plenty of cases where he, mocks that very idea of the instantaneity of love, but yet it's still out there, and it's still, it's something it's hard to get rid of, right? This idea of love as being instant. All right, so there's, love and death, right? So in human terms, there's also all sorts of kind of Renaissance disciplines that increasingly involve timing, right? Like, so that just in practical terms, people are thinking more about timing all the time. One of them is music, dance. I'm not a music scholar, but I know that there's, polyphony, right? Is part of the music of this period. You get complex interweaving parts. That's got a bit more pressure on the notion of timing. You have navigation and seamanship. Certainly celestial navigation requires precise attention to timing. Boats were getting more and more complicated, right? So there's an awful lot of timing involved in just doing anything with these really, really complex machines. And of course, professional theater, close to Shakespeare's heart. Timing is important, particularly in comedy. And Shakespeare was aware of this. There's the famous advice to the players in Hamlet, where he says lots of things about theater, but one of the things he says is that you got to make sure that your lines come not tardily off, which means if you're not saying the thing at the right moment, you kind of like lose all the effect. So these are sort of general, disciplines that kind of require these particular elements. Also, there's a general change in attitude, which seems to be focusing things on the moment of time. And this is the attitude towards fortune itself. So in the late medieval world, you got fortune's wheel, right? Wheel of fortune, she turns the wheel, you're all stuck on the wheel. That's the medieval image, which we still have today. But in Renaissance, that begins to change. So this is an image of fortune, renamed occasion. She got her wheel here, right? This is from an emblem book. Emblem books always come with mottos, so they're a real good kind of like an index of general thought in the period. And here's the motto: "I am the captured moment of time. I stand on a ball constantly turning, not paying quite attention to the picture, have rings on my feet and a razor in my hand. You may grasp me by the lock of hair on my forehead, but the back of my head is shaved, so that once I take my leave, I cannot be held." So this is the origin of the phrase "seize fortune by the forelock," which you may not have heard, but it's out there. Right? The idea is, right, if you wait till fortune's passing you, then she's all bald behind you. There's nothing to grab onto. You're supposed to grab her by the hair, right? But what it does is it's focusing attention on the idea of seizing your fortune, which is a classic kind of Renaissance ambition thing to do, in a narrowing window of opportunity. There is this moment when everything is perfect, and if you miss the moment, you're in trouble. That's the new way of thinking about fortune. In the Middle Ages, people thought, fortunes will rise, fortunes will fall, you're nailed to the wheel, you have no control. This, by the way, there's a lot of control, but you got to find the right moment. So there's those things as well. As it turns out, the discipline that pays most attention to timing in the Renaissance is dancing. Yep. All of the texts on fencing spend a lot of time talking about tempo. So if any discipline is like super interested in timing, it's Renaissance fencing. So I'll give you like a quick introduction here, right? That'll help us. In the late Middle Ages, right? It's not as though they didn't have martial arts then, right? So they had the broadsword. So you imagine for a second this is a broadsword. They had all sorts of colorful names for the various positions that you can do, right? So there's like, you know, the ox or the plow or like the tail, right? these fancy names. But in the Renaissance, what happened is that all got thrown out the window, right? And the rapier, emerged, and a whole new school of thought evolved to go with the rapier, and it evolved in Italy. So all of the masters are Italian. Their ideas percolated to England. In many cases, Italian masters would go to England and set up a school there as well. So you learn from the Italians, and that's why the language is full of that. All of the major figures, their day job was mathematics. They were all mathematicians, right? So they had their own colorful language to talk about fencing. So they said, well, there's 4 guards, okay? And they're mathematicians, right? So here's guard number 1 is up here, and they called it guard number 1, prima guarda, good colorful name. Here's this one, which they called guard number 2, guard number 3, and guard number 4. So prima, seconda, terza, and quarta. And if you know anything about the modern martial arts, you realize that like what's being described here is like the cone of defense, right? It's all about keeping the other person from stabbing you with their sword. And you'd think that fencing would all be about how to kill the other person, right? But about 90% of every piece of advice in any fencing manual is how not to die. So it's all about the guard. And if you're going to attack somebody, you attack in a guard. So if I'm going to stick the other guy in quarta, right, I move my sword like this, I extend my hand, I lean, and I lunge, right? All in one guard. So you stay in the guard throughout the whole thing. But they also said, it doesn't really matter. You can learn the guards. That's not as important. The 2 things you need to know, the 2 most important things, are tempo, or time, and measure, misura. Measure is, of course, like the distance you are from your opponent, right? So like knowing when they can stick you, or whether, like when you move back or forward. And it's related to tempo because the timing of what you're doing will depend on how close you are. But I'm not going to talk much about measure. I'm going to talk about tempo because tempo is way more complex than measure, which is pretty straightforward. But those are the 2 concepts, right? So they said you need to know about tempo, and that's why they talk so much about it. Also because it's not easy, right? Here's Capoferro. Anyone ever see The Princess Bride? Okay. There's a famous fencing scene in there. They refer to all these like names. They're all the Italian masters. So Capoferro is in for The Princess Bride. He's the real dude himself. What does he say about tempo? All right. Tempo is nothing but the measurement of stillness and motion. The stillness of my sword point measures the motion of my adversary's body. The motion of my adversary's body measures the stillness of my sword point. This is kind of complicated. What does it mean to measure stillness, for one thing? But clearly, tempo, it's not simply a question of like external measures of time. You're not sort of like timing your behavior. It's an internal measure. The time is determined by the relationship between you and your opponent, between their sword point and your body, or your sword point and their body. It is that sort of complex interchange. They talked a lot about false time, right? The kind of thing that I was accused of doing. And basically, it looks like what they're advising is if you attack, you have to do it in a particular series of motions to get it right. So if I'm here, and usually they'd start with the weight on the back foot, and Italians like Capoferro, they have this weird sort of chicken wing going on here, which is really protecting your face. Right? So you start here, and what you would first do is this is the first motion, this is the second motion, and then this is the third motion. Okay? But when you're watching this happen, there's no first, second, third. You just see it happen, right? Like it's all one thing. It's all one fluid motion. You're not supposed to be like, right? But what tempo does is, and so false motion is, right, if I go like this, and then this, that's false. That's false time. Instructors would hate that, right? So if you're watching people who do it right, like who can really do it, not like I'm slowing it down there, it all seems very fluid, right? There's no sense of like, well, you know, what are they doing with tempo and what's happening there? Because the discipline itself is based on segmenting or dividing time in ways that are in some ways imperceptible, right? So there are ideas about timing that you're not visibly seeing in the sense of a sequence of actions. Okay, so timing, fencing, super important. Now what I need to know, right, is like, okay, so to what extent is that part of the fencing and the stage fighting in Romeo and Juliet? Like, we're back to the play. Yeah, I know there's a lot of stage fighting. Is tempo really important there or not? The most important or the most famous stage fight is the time when Mercutio gets killed, right? So there's a fight between Mercutio, who's Romeo's best friend, and Tybalt, who represents the opposing family. And Mercutio gets his death wound in this fight because Romeo makes an ill-timed intervention in the middle of it. This is after he's in love with Juliet, so he's kind of thinking fuzzily about like putting the families back together. Anyway, he tries to intervene, and he gets involved, gets in between, and that lets Tybalt stab Mercutio. Mercutio is dying. So right away, timing looks like, well, maybe it's important here. Here's what Mercutio says about Tybalt before this fight starts. He doesn't like him, right? He's a very butcher of a silk button, a duelist. He fights as you sing prick song, keeps time, distance, and proportion. Rests me his minimum rest, 1, 2, and the third in your bosom. You see the musical connections here, right? Like the constant idea. This is all about tempo. And Mercutio he's disparaging, but he's also recognizing how deadly this is. And, if you just think about, it doesn't have to be dueling, really. It could be any fight, right? Like, if you get your timing wrong when there's pointy objects involved, it is a matter of life and death, right? Timing matters, right? It's not an abstract concept when you're facing somebody else who's trying to hurt you. So they do talk about the language of tempo in the fighting itself. All right, but then what about fencing and love, right? Like, okay, so yeah, they talk about tempo a lot in stage fighting. Are there connections with love? Well, all right, I'm going to use as a transition here, I'm going to use something that people have noticed for a long time, right? Here's Mercutio dying now, right? He's talking about tempo. Again, he's criticizing the guy. A braggart, a rogue, a villain that fights by the book of arithmetic, which has sent scholars go on crazy trying to find what book is he referring to. There isn't really one. It's kind of a waste of ink. But people have done that. But fights by the book, right? Well, it turns out that line by the book occurs in a love context, right? This is actually earlier in the play, so I'm interposing these here. But Juliet, after their first kiss, says, "You kiss by the book," which has been taken as an insult, right? Who wants to be told that they kiss by the book? A mild insult, even though it doesn't make any sense in the context that she would be really insulting there. Maybe she's teasing, I don't know, right? But what this does, which by the way has sent people looking for where's the book? Not there. This idea of by the book suggests that there's that these are kind of organized activities or disciplines in which there is a set of rules, and certainly Shakespeare is kind of calling attention to the connections between them with these verbal echoes, giving us maybe license to proceed, to look more closely. So this is long here, okay? This is the meeting of Romeo and Juliet, the famous meeting where they fall in love. I'll read it through because you want to read it, right? It's at a party, right? Romeo says, "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims, let he stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." Juliet says, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss." Romeo says, "Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too? Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer." Romeo, "Oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take." So notice that there's a rhyme scheme here, handstand, this kiss. It's going on here. There's a couplet at the end. It's 14 lines long. You'll notice what's 14 lines long, it's a sonnet, right? My students love this. I'm like, oh my god, it's a sonnet, but you know, yeah. Right. It makes it stand out. This is what movie folks call the meet cute in Shakespeare style, right? Their nation might say, oh, look at that. It is unusual to have a sonnet in the middle of a play. It's also unusual to have any sonnet where it's two voices contributing to create one sonnet. That goes against a lot of what's happening in the sonnets period. And so maybe, I'm thinking there's some structural parallels here between this activity and the way that dueling happens. For one thing, you notice they start with slowly, right, and they're speeding up towards the end. Things are changing. So Romeo is in one kind of measure here, and Juliet responds in the same measure. And these quatrains, right, are intended to be like parallel in some ways. They both begin with hands, they both end in kissing, the rhyme schemes match in some ways, like she's meeting him and matching him at the same degree. But she's also sort of inviting him into closer measure, and the closer you get, the faster the tempo gets, right? So they speed up here. The end, the couplet at the end, notice that it is, like there's actual opposition here, not move, move not, right? Like that sense of like they're pairing each other. It's also about motion, right? Juliet's motion is the moving of emotion, right, within. Romeo is basically saying, hold still, I kiss you. But it's still about motion. And what it's giving us here is an interchange between two opponents in which time and measure are determined within the context of their exchange and bring them together for an action. So when Juliet says you kissed by the book after this, you can just as well be saying like, oh my god, look what we just did, right? Like it's a sonnet, it's all amazing, right? So there are structural similarities between the way that love is being enacted between these two figures and fencing. But there's no where's our smoking gun? Like, do they to what extent do they care about the instant of time itself, right, in the play? Well, Romeo and Juliet's full of time references. It is actually the play in which there's more characters talking about time than any other play. But they do talk about the instant of change, and it does seem to be particularly concerning. So here's Juliet after the famous balcony scene, right? And she's worried, right? She says, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning, which doth cease to be ere one can say it lightens, right? Reminding us, by the way, I think we sort of lost that sense of lightning as lightening, right? But that's very much available in the period. So she's worried that the end of whatever it is that's happened will somehow also occur below the threshold of perception, that she will gain and lose in a single moment, like what she's looking for. That's an anxiety there. Later, Friar Lawrence, right? This is later, sorry about that. Is advising. He's trying to calm Romeo down and try to really tell him, you shouldn't be behaving this way. He says, these violent delights have violent ends. Which, by the way, is a famous line in TV series Westworld. I don't know if you watched it. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. Again, this idea that somehow if it begins in an instant, it might somehow end awfully quickly as well. There is no logic to that, right? There's no reason why an experience that begins in an instant might, would necessarily end in the same way. To understand that, you need to understand that the most common way of solving Zeno's paradox in the period is not mathematics yet at this point. It's a way that we would never use. Thomas Aquinas says, if you take an object in motion and you freeze it, right, in one spot, it's got motion. How do you understand that motion? Well, he says it must have its end inherently encoded somehow in the moving object, right? Like it must be in there somewhere, even though we can't say we can't measure it. It has the end of motion must be inherent in the object at the instant of time. Well, that means if objects are in motion, their beginnings and their endings, that moment, like the frozen moment, the instantaneity of the event, must somehow encode the ending and might then, therefore, contaminate the ending of that. All right, all this comes together in the tomb scene, right? Where the final failure of timing happens. Romeo here is commenting on the dead Juliet. He says, how oft when men are at the point of death, and they that marry, which their keepers call a lightning before death. Oh, how may I call this a lightning? O my love, my wife, death, that has sucked the honey of thy breath, hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. Thou art not conquered. Beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advancing there. There's a terrible dramatic irony here because she looks like she's not dead because she's not dead, right? You know, but this is the problem with the instant of death, right? Like the instant before death and after death, a body looks the same, right? Like what has changed? Nothing has changed momentarily after death. It's the same thing. So like this recognition, like wow, she looks like she's alive, like that's a common thought about death and about the instant of time in the period. So that draws attention again to that, like the instantaneous situation of death. Plus there's the lightning thing, which again must be, in some ways must be that kind of echo of the lightning moment, even though it's really a lightening, right, before death. They are the same word. So, here at this moment, it looks like it's calling attention to that. So I would say, right, it looks very much as though the instant of time or change is itself freighted with a kind of a burden of tragedy in that period, right? It's thought of as both mysterious, deeply interesting, but also problematic and threatening in lots of ways, like what's happening below the threshold of our understanding, in ways that we have, to some degree, lost. So we're more likely to think about this as like misfortune being, elevated, to, like forced into the level of tragedy. But it might be true that this, like, the thinking about the nature of time like this is inherently more tragic for the early moderns than it was for us. And therefore, perhaps, right, like, one of the keys to the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. Now, I don't know whether you bought an argument, but you can see, like, try to figure out whether you can make it, how far it works. I don't know whether I would have arrived at any of this if I had done that moment in a gym in Chicago. Probably, though, not, because fencing manuals, they're really dense, they're really difficult. It's hard to describe a physical activity in prose and make sense. I think Jess, you use assignments like this in English 101, right, where like it's really hard to do, so it's good work for them to do. But it means for scholars, like if you're not trying to reconstruct it, you may not see certain things. You may not get that moment of insight that then will set you on a path of potential discovery. So I think those things are definitely important. All right, so I would say thanks to Ali Harnish, who's been editing my work, to Nicole Zellner for talking me down from Zeno's Paradox, FTC for funding everything I've ever done for years and years and years, and there it is.